This is
My
a
mother
fictional
tried
story,
to turn my
created for
wedding into
entertainment
my sister's
purposes.
wedding,
Any resemblance to
and
real
acted
people,
like I wouldn't
names,
care.
places, or
Nothing
events
brings
is purely
old family
coincidental.
damage to the surface faster than a wedding. I found that out while sitting on my apartment floor in a half-open robe, surrounded by fabric swatches, guest lists, and a cold cup of coffee I kept forgetting to drink. My fiancé was at the kitchen counter trying to compare catering quotes like a normal, emotionally stable person, and I was pretending my mother's name on the guest spreadsheet didn't already make my jaw tight. My name is Noelle. I was 31, living in upstate New York, engaged to a man I'd been with for 5 years, and I had convinced myself that getting married as an adult would feel clean and separate from everything ugly that happened when I was little. That was adorable of me. Very optimistic. Very stupid. My parents split when I was 5. Not in the vague, civilized way adults later described to make themselves look better. My mother cheated. My father found out. There was yelling behind a bedroom door that never fully shut. And I remember my father carrying a duffel bag while I stood in the hallway hugging a stuffed rabbit by one ear. A few hours later, the man she cheated with walked into the house like he belonged there. I didn't understand grown-up relationships, but I understood replacement. Kids always do. A few days after that, my father came by to see me while he was staying with my grandparents. I asked if I could go with him. I still remember the way he froze, like he was afraid to look too hopeful. My mother didn't fight it. That's the part that stayed with me more than the affair, more than the screaming, more than the details everybody thinks are the real trauma. She just let me go. Like I was a sweater she didn't wear anymore. She married that man fast. Then she had another daughter, my half-sister. And from that point on, I was the child from the first life, the one she visited emotionally when convenient. I grew up mostly with my father and my grandparents. My father worked like crazy, then eventually bought a small house 3 streets over from my grandparents. And between the 3 of them, I had school lunches, birthday cakes, rides to practice, awkward talks about boys, and all the boring, ordinary things that actually make a childhood feel safe. When I was in high school, my father met someone quiet and steady. They got married a few years later. My stepmother never tried to replace anyone or force closeness, which is probably why I trusted her from the start. My mother, meanwhile, had a new baby, a new husband, a new house, and apparently very limited emotional bandwidth. I did still visit, less and less as I got older. Every time I went over there, I felt like one of those people invited to a holiday by obligation. There were photos of my sister everywhere. School portraits, dance pictures, little handprint crafts. I don't say this dramatically. I mean literally everywhere. I once looked around the living room and realized there was not one current photo of me in that house. Not one. I was in the story, technically, but never in the frame. My sister and I never built the kind of bond people assume sisters automatically have. She always wanted whatever I had, but not in the sweet little sister way people laugh about. It was more like she couldn't stand that something had been mine first. If I got attention, she needed more. If I got praise, she needed louder praise. If I had a boyfriend in college, suddenly she had a tragic situationship with the most misunderstood man alive. That kind of thing. I kept my distance because distance was easier than explaining why every interaction left me feeling weirdly robbed. By the time I met my fiancé, I had a decent life. Nothing flashy. I worked in administration for a medical office, paid my bills, forgot to water plants, and spent too much money on candles I claimed were self-care. He was steady in a way that didn't feel performative. No speeches, no games, just solid. When we got engaged, my father cried before I did, which I honestly hadn't prepared for. He said he wanted to help pay for the wedding because he'd been waiting a long time to see me get the kind of joyful day nobody could take from me. I should have realized right there that the phrase "nobody could take from me" was tempting fate. We planned the wedding for over a year. A lakeside estate outside town, old trees, a long stone path, soft lights over the reception patio. Not huge, not celebrity nonsense, just elegant in that way that makes you feel prettier than you actually are. My stepmother helped quietly with details. My father paid for more than I was comfortable with. My fiancé kept telling me to stop apologizing every time somebody did something nice for me. We were 2 months out and everything was finally starting to feel real in a good way. Then my mother called me out of nowhere on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting at my desk trying to fix a payroll error. She almost never called. Texted when she needed something, sure. But called? No. So the second I saw her name, I already knew peace was over. She started the call in that syrupy voice she uses when she's about to ask for something outrageous and wants to lay a blanket over it first. She asked how planning was going. She asked if I was excited. She even said she was proud of me. which hit me so strangely that I nearly looked over my shoulder to see who she was actually talking to. Then she told me my sister had gotten engaged. That alone would have been surprising enough because last I'd heard my sister was dating a guy who borrowed money from her and called emotional chaos passion. But before I could even say congratulations, my mother rushed into the real reason for the call. My sister and her fiancé couldn't afford a proper wedding. Things were tight. They were embarrassed. And since my venue was so beautiful, and since families should support each other, and since it would be meaningful for both daughters to share something special, what would I think about letting my sister use my venue the same day? I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, more because my brain couldn't process that she had said that with a straight face. She kept going like she hadn't just set a match to my nervous system. Her idea was that my sister could have a small morning ceremony, and I'd still have my wedding later that afternoon. Same location, same flowers in place, same setup. It would save money. It would be romantic. People did joint celebrations all the time, apparently. She was saying all this like she was suggesting we share a casserole recipe, not my wedding day. I said no immediately. No hesitation. No softening. Just no. That should have been the end of it. But with my mother, no isn't a boundary. It's an opening offer. For the next couple of weeks, she came at me from every angle. Calls on my lunch break. Long texts at night. Voice notes so dramatic you would have thought my refusal had caused a humanitarian crisis. She told me I was lucky to have help from my father. She reminded me my sister didn't have the same support. She said it would be beautiful for us to heal through this. Heal through what, exactly? Her cheating? Her abandoning me emotionally? Her years of acting like I was a distant cousin she felt mildly guilty about? Very interesting use of the word heal. When guilt didn't work, she tried sentiment. She's your only sister. That line always irritates me because it assumes proximity creates intimacy. She is my only sister, yes. She is also a person who once flirted with a guy I was seeing in college while sitting in my room borrowing my sweater. Technical labels don't undo patterns. I told her as calmly as I could at first that my sister's finances were not my responsibility. If she wanted a courthouse wedding, a backyard wedding, a church basement with grocery store cake and one folding table, fine. Plenty of people do that. But she was not using my venue, not sharing my date, and definitely not being folded into an event my father was paying for. That last part mattered more than anything, because that was the part nobody said out loud. My mother wasn't asking me to share. She was asking me to hand over access to something built by the one parent who actually showed up. That was the knife in it. She wanted me to make space, again, for the family she chose over me, using resources that came from the life I built without her. I vented to my fiancé one night while standing in the bathroom taking out my earrings with way too much force. He listened the way he always did, leaning in the doorway, letting me spin out until the anger became coherent. Then he said, very carefully, "You know you don't owe them a symbolic gesture just because they decided your day looks easier than theirs." That should have comforted me. Instead, I cried. Not because I disagreed, because he had said it so plainly. My whole childhood had trained me to think resistance made me mean. It takes an embarrassing amount of work to teach yourself that self-protection isn't cruelty. A few days later, I found out my mother had contacted him directly. He told me that evening in the car, right after we'd picked up sample linens from the rental place. He was holding the steering wheel with both hands in that very calm way he does when he's about to deliver information he knows I'm not going to enjoy. My mother had called him, acted sweet, said she just wanted to talk as family, then repeated the same story about my sister's money problems and how small the morning ceremony would be. She apparently told him he seemed like the kind of man who would understand generosity. I stared at him and said, "Did she really try to recruit you into my own emotional mugging?" He laughed once, which honestly saved her life in that moment because if he'd looked too serious, I might have driven straight to her house. He told me he said he would never make a decision about our wedding without me. He also told her, politely, that our answer was still no. Then he asked if I wanted him to block her number. Reader, future bride, random stranger who enjoys family chaos from a safe distance. Choose a partner who offers to block your mother without needing a committee meeting. I told him not yet. Mostly because I still had this dumb, stubborn hope that if I was clear enough, direct enough, adult enough, my mother would eventually stop. I always underestimate how much some people are willing to bulldoze when they think their need is morally prettier than yours. And for about a week, it got quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful so much as organized. I should have trusted that feeling. I really should have. The quiet broke when one of my aunts called me on a Saturday morning while I was at the grocery store comparing two equally depressing bags of salad. She asked if I'd seen my sister's wedding invitation yet. I told her I had not. Because as far as I knew, there was no wedding beyond my mother's fantasy campaign. There was a pause. The kind adults do when they're deciding whether to mind their business or light the entire family on fire with information. Then she said, very carefully, that invitations had gone out for my sister's wedding on the exact same date as mine, at the exact same venue. She said the card described it as a joint family celebration. Joint. Family. Celebration. I left my cart right there by the produce and walked outside because my ears started ringing. My aunt sent me a photo of the invitation. Cream cardstock, little flowers printed in the corners, my sister's name in giant script, and beneath it, wording that made it sound like both sides of the family had lovingly coordinated this whole thing together. Not only that, but this was not the tiny morning event my mother had described. More than 50 invitations had gone out. Extended relatives, family friends, people from my mother's church, a whole audience. I called my mother before I even got to my car. She didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. So I drove to her house with the kind of focus that makes every red light feel like a personal insult. She opened the door looking startled but not startled enough. That was what pushed me over. Because some part of her had expected this. Some part of her knew I would find out eventually, and had decided to ride the lie until impact. I walked in without waiting to be invited and slapped the printed invitation onto her dining table. What is this? She looked at it like she had never seen paper before. Then the tears started. Immediate. Weapon grade. She said my sister and my stepfather had been pressuring her. She said she had told them she was sure she could get me to come around. She said the invitations had already gone out before she realized how serious it all had become. She said she was in an impossible position. That phrase really got me. Impossible for whom? Because from where I was standing, her impossible position looked an awful lot like consequences for lying. I asked where my sister was. My mother said she'd gone out. Convenient. Then came the ask. Not an apology. Not accountability. The ask. She told me that since the invitations were already out, and people had already saved the date, maybe I could just reconsider. Just this once. Just for family. She said canceling now would humiliate everyone. That word again. Humiliate. Amazing how often humiliation only matters when it happens to them. I sat down because I suddenly felt tired in my bones. It was one of those moments where anger moves past heat and turns cold. I looked around her kitchen, at the magnets on the fridge, at the fruit bowl nobody probably touched, at the ordinary details of a life she had built while I orbited outside it, and I realized something that should have hit me years earlier. My answer had never mattered to her. She had already decided the outcome she wanted and treated my consent like paperwork she'd submit later. So I told her very clearly that I would not be sharing my wedding day, my venue, or 1 second of that event with my sister. I told her she had lied to people using my name, and she could untell those lies herself. I told her my sister, my stepfather, and she herself were no longer invited to my wedding. Not maybe. Not until they apologized. Not if they promised to behave. No. Full stop. She started sobbing harder, which usually would have made me shrink. But something in me had snapped clean through. She asked how I could do this to my own mother. I said, I think the more interesting question is how you did this to your own daughter. I wish I could say I delivered that line like some composed, victorious woman in a prestige drama. I did not. I was shaking. My voice cracked in the middle. I had mascara under one eye. Still counts. When I got back in my car, I sat there with both hands on the wheel and felt that weird grief that comes after somebody finally confirms something you've been trying not to know. I wasn't heartbroken because my mother had chosen my sister in that moment. I was heartbroken because I understood she had been choosing her for years, in big ways and tiny ways, and I had kept dressing it up as misunderstanding because the truth was uglier. I called my father from the driveway. He listened quietly while I told him everything, then said, "Okay, we're handling it." That man has never been flashy. He doesn't rant. He doesn't posture. But when he says we're handling it, walls go up. He paid for security at the venue before I could even tell him that seemed dramatic. He also told me to call the venue coordinator immediately and explain the situation so nobody could make changes behind our backs. I did. The coordinator, bless her competent little soul, sounded horrified on my behalf. She confirmed that only my fiancé and I had any authority over the booking, and she added notes to the file about my mother, my sister, and my stepfather not being permitted on the property. For 2 days after that, everything went silent again. No calls, no texts, no dramatic essays. It almost made me nervous, like the family storm had passed too quickly to be natural. Then my mother showed up at my apartment building just before dinner, pounding on the buzzer hard enough that my upstairs neighbor texted me to ask if I owed money to somebody. She looked awful when I opened the door. Puffy eyes, hair frizzed by humidity, anger pouring off her in waves. But instead of apologizing, she launched right into accusation. My sister had to cancel everything. People were talking. My stepfather was furious. My sister wasn't eating. She said I had humiliated the family, ruined my sister's engagement, and turned what should have been a happy season into a disgrace. I remember standing there in socks, holding a dish towel, thinking, wow, she really came over here to tell me I should feel bad for stopping my own wedding from being stolen. So I told her, as calmly as I could, that none of this would have happened if she had accepted my first no, that she and my sister created this mess without my consent, and were now trying to hand me the emotional bill. Then I said the thing I'd been circling for years without ever landing on it. You have one daughter in that house, I told her. Act like it, because I'm done begging to be treated like one. And then I shut the door. Not gracefully, not with wisdom, just shut it. I stood there with my forehead against the wood for a full minute afterward, shaking so hard I thought I might throw up. My fiancé came out of the kitchen and asked if she was gone. I said yes and then started crying in the ugly, breathless way that makes your whole face hurt. He held me. I hated that I needed that. I also needed it. The wedding itself went ahead exactly as planned, which felt surreal after the weeks leading up to it. There was security at the gate. The coordinator had a printed list like she was protecting state secrets. And my father checked in on me every 10 minutes with the calm face of a man trying not to commit a felony in formal wear. The morning of, I woke up before my alarm and just stared at the ceiling of the bridal suite for a while. Not because I was having second thoughts about getting married. Absolutely not. I was having very specific thoughts about whether my mother would show up in some dramatic church lady outfit and force a scene in front of strangers. Weddings make you feel glamorous in photos and feral in your actual nervous system. My stepmother came in first with coffee and a quiet little smile. She has never tried to replace my mother, which is probably why I trust her more than I ever trusted the original. She asked how I was doing and I told her the truth. Excited, nauseous, angry, relieved, embarrassed that I was still angry, and weirdly guilty for not being sadder that my mother wasn't there. She said, "Sometimes peace feels more unfamiliar than grief." Then she handed me concealer because my under eyes were making a statement. I got ready with a few close friends, my cousin from my father's side, and a makeup artist who had clearly seen enough family drama and bridal suites to know when not to ask questions. Every now and then I'd hear footsteps in the hall and my whole body would tense. Nothing happened. No one crashed in, no security call, no screaming in the parking lot. Just the normal wedding chaos of lost bobby pins, and somebody needing the steamer and my friend almost dropping an earring down the sink. When my father came in to see me before the ceremony, he stopped in the doorway and covered his mouth for a second. That almost did me in more than the vows. Because he looked so proud. Not proud in the pageant parent way. Proud in the I remember every hard year and you still made it here kind of way. He kissed my forehead and said, "Nobody gets to touch today." I nodded like a brave person and then cried directly onto the front of my robe. Walking down that stone path with him beside me felt like crossing into a life that had room for joy without needing permission. I know that sounds suspiciously like a line from somebody trying too hard, but that's honestly what it felt like. The lake was bright behind the chairs. My fiancé was at the end of the aisle looking like he couldn't quite believe I was real. My father squeezed my arm once before handing me over, and for that small stretch of time I wasn't the daughter who had been sidelined, or the older sister expected to absorb impact, or the woman fighting old ghosts in a nice dress. I was just there, present, wanted, chosen. The ceremony was perfect in all the ways that actually matter. Not because every flower behaved or because my hair held up in the humidity, though praise be, it mostly did. It was perfect because I felt safe, because when I looked out at the guests, I saw people who had shown up for me, not people waiting to see whether family dysfunction would perform for them between courses. At the reception, I danced with my father, laughed too hard during the speeches, and ate approximately 3 bites of dinner, because apparently spending that much money on food does not guarantee the bride will physically remember how chewing works. A few relatives from my mother's side came, the ones who had privately reached out after the invitation disaster and said they understood why I did what I did. They were polite, a little awkward. I appreciated the effort anyway. And yes, because life cannot let a dramatic situation die with dignity, I kept checking over my shoulder for half the night. Every time the main doors opened, my stomach dropped. My husband noticed by the second hour and leaned in during one dance to say, "If they show up, we leave together. You don't handle a thing alone." I laughed and told him that was a deeply unromantic but very sexy promise. No one showed up. By the end of the night, that absence stopped feeling scary and started feeling like relief. For once, nobody showed up to invade my day. I realized I had spent so many years bracing for my mother to intrude emotionally that actual calm felt suspicious. That's not a healthy thing to discover in a wedding gown, but there it was. After the honeymoon, which was short and local and exactly what we could emotionally handle after all that nonsense, information started filtering back to me through relatives. Apparently, the canceled wedding had caused a huge mess on my mother's side. My sister's fiancé had been furious from the beginning, which did not surprise me because even through the fog of this disaster, I had a vague sense he wasn't driving the bus. He was just foolish enough to get on it. He had objected, according to one cousin, when he found out how many invitations had been sent and what they implied. He and my sister fought. My stepfather got involved because of course he did. My mother cried. People took sides. Some relatives backed my sister out of reflex because she's younger and more fragile-looking, and the world has a weird weakness for women who weaponize helplessness prettily. Other relatives started questioning why she needed my exact venue, my exact date, and what sounded an awful lot like my exact event. That last part mattered, because once people start asking practical questions, manipulation loses some of its perfume. Still, my mother wasn't done. Not emotionally, not narratively. She started telling people a revised version of events where I had always hated my sister, where I had spitefully refused a tiny request, where the whole thing had only escalated because I was cold and unforgiving and maybe a little jealous. Jealous of what I honestly couldn't tell you. Debt? Chaos? A man with no boundaries and a vague job? But okay. At first I wanted to defend myself to everyone. That old impulse flared hard. I drafted messages in my notes app. I rehearsed calm explanations in the shower. I imagined family members reading my version and finally understanding me with tears in their eyes. Then my husband pointed out something both gentle and devastating. People who want to understand usually ask. People who prefer the prettier lie don't. So I stopped chasing everybody. I answered when directly asked. I kept it factual. No dramatic essays. No, you won't believe what she did, even though frankly people should have believed it. And slowly, I started seeing who had room for reality, and who was emotionally invested in keeping my mother blameless, because it was easier than admitting she'd built her second family on top of the first. About 6 weeks after the wedding, one of my mother's cousins called me and said, "I think you've been carrying the role of difficult daughter for a long time when really you were the one being asked to make everybody comfortable." I thanked her and then sat in my car outside the pharmacy crying for 10 minutes because sometimes the thing that breaks you isn't cruelty. It's being accurately seen by somebody who didn't owe you that effort. I wish I could say that was the emotional turning point, and I spent the next month glowing with healthy boundaries and marital bliss. That would have been great. In reality, I was still twitchy, still checking my phone too often, still having these weird flashes where I'd be folding laundry and suddenly feel 6 years old again, watching a home rearrange itself around other people's choices. My husband handled it better than I did. Mostly because he was not raised in my family and therefore had the enormous advantage of perspective. He would catch me apologizing for being too much and ask, too much for who? He'd remind me that cutting contact after repeated violations wasn't dramatic. It was information. He also took over answering the apartment buzzer for a while because apparently my nervous system had assigned our intercom the emotional weight of a bomb. And then, just when things were settling into a rhythm that almost felt normal, my mother called my father. She didn't call me, she didn't text. She went to him, which was both strategic and deeply insulting. According to my father, she said my sister was depressed, not eating right, barely sleeping, and at serious risk of losing her relationship for good. She said the broken engagement was my fault because I had been inflexible. Then she asked whether he could either convince me to help pay for therapy or persuade me to make some kind of public statement clearing my sister of bad intentions. When my father told me that over dinner, I laughed so hard I snorted iced tea. Not because it was funny, because it was obscene. The sheer nerve of asking the man who paid for my wedding to financially clean up the fallout from their attempt to hijack it? Incredible. Honestly, almost creative. He had told her no. Obviously. More than no. He told her she needed to stop treating me as a resource to solve problems created in her other household. That phrase hit me straight in the chest. A resource. That was it. That was the thing I had felt for years and never named properly. Not loved conditionally, used selectively. Called when convenient. Expected to provide softness, money, grace, access, silence. Whatever would keep things running over there while my own feelings remained negotiable. I sat with that for a long time after he said it. Resource. It made the whole shape of my childhood click into place in a way that made me angry all over again, but also weirdly steadier. Because once you name a pattern, it stops feeling like a personal failure and starts looking like what it is. That night, my husband found me at the kitchen table staring at nothing and asked what was wrong. I told him I was mad that one sentence could explain 15 years. He poured me a glass of water, sat across from me, and said, "Then maybe the next 15 get to be built around different sentences." I hated how comforting that was. I also wrote it down later. For a while after that, things were quiet enough that I started believing distance might hold, not heal. I wasn't chasing healing anymore. Just hold. There is a difference. Healing is warm and hopeful and comes with journaling prompts. Holding is duct tape and routine and choosing not to answer unknown numbers. I settled back into work. My husband and I figured out married life in the least glamorous ways possible. Who forgot to switch the laundry? Which side of the bed made more sense once winter hit and the vent started acting weird? Whether we have food at home still counted as a loving sentence when said while eating crackers over the sink. I liked that part. I liked the ordinariness. After months of emotional pageantry, ordinary felt luxurious. Still, my mother and sister kept drifting in through other people. A relative would mention that my mother was having a hard time. Someone else would say my sister was devastated that I had turned the family against her. This fascinated me because, first of all, I do not have that kind of power, and second, nobody had needed my help to notice she behaved like a lunatic. The family wasn't turned against her. The family had been handed printed evidence and a front row seat. My husband wanted me to stop engaging with any of it. He was probably right. But I was still in that ugly middle stage where I had boundaries in theory and adrenaline in practice. So when one of my cousins forwarded me a long message from my mother saying she didn't understand why I was punishing her for wanting both her daughters to feel equally celebrated, I responded. Not elegantly. I told her there had never been equality between us, and using that language now was almost insulting. I told her wanting my things, my timing, my venue, and my father's money for my sister was not celebration. It was theft with manners. She replied with one sentence that somehow managed to be both self-pitying and accusatory. "One day you'll understand what it's like to have children pulling you in different directions." I read it 3 times and felt my whole face go hot. Because that's what she thought this was. Not years of neglect, not favoritism, not one daughter being treated as expendable and the other as central. Just the burden of motherhood. As if she had been torn equally when the truth was she had always leaned the same way. I blocked her after that, not dramatically. Just tapped the screen and did it. Then I sat on the couch staring at my phone like it had turned into a small animal in my hand. I thought I'd feel powerful. Mostly I felt tired. Grief doesn't always make a speech when it leaves. Sometimes it just takes your appetite for the evening. My stepmother called the next day. Not to pry, just to check in. She's good at that. She said my father had told her my mother was still circling and asked if I wanted to come for dinner later in the week. I said yes, and when we went, I found my old favorite dessert on the table without anybody making a big deal about it. That is love too, by the way. Not the grand cinematic kind people post about. The kind that remembers what soothed you when you were 12 and offers it quietly at 31. Dinner was mostly normal until my father asked, "Do you think you'll ever speak to her again?" No pressure in his voice, just a question. I said I didn't know. Because I didn't. People love absolutes when they're not the ones living inside them. Cut her off forever. Forgive her now. Have compassion. Protect your peace. Great slogans. Terrible company at 2 a.m. when you're wondering whether becoming unreachable makes you strong or just lonely in a new way. My father nodded and said that not knowing was fine. Then he added, "But whatever you choose, don't confuse guilt with obligation." I wish somebody had printed that on a poster for my childhood bedroom. A couple of weeks later, my sister's fiancé officially called off their engagement. That came to me through the family grapevine. Naturally, because apparently no event in that household can occur without making at least 3 circles around the county first. Different people gave different reasons. Some said he couldn't handle the embarrassment. Some said he had already been having doubts and this just exposed bigger problems. One person hinted there had been ugly fights about money that had nothing to do with me. That version felt the most believable. People who treat a wedding like a costume rarely have healthy conversations about the marriage part. My mother, however, blamed me publicly and often. She told relatives my refusal had broken my sister's heart. She told one elderly aunt I had always resented my sister for being loved more, which is one of those statements so accidentally honest you almost have to admire it. Because yes, I had resented exactly that. What a strange thing to say out loud while imagining it made me look unreasonable. I thought the breakup might calm my sister down. I thought maybe humiliation would at least buy her a little self-awareness. Again, adorable of me. Instead, she got meaner. It started small. A fake account viewing my social media stories. Somebody sending me a screenshot of a vague post that was clearly about me. Something about women who act superior because they got lucky with money and men. A cousin reporting that my sister had called me calculating, cold, and obsessed with winning. The projection was almost elegant. Almost. I kept ignoring it. Mostly because responding would have dragged me right back into the mud. Also because I had work, rent, grocery lists, and a husband who deserved better than watching me spend our first year married shadowboxing family nonsense every night. Then Christmas approached. I should tell you that I have never loved Christmas in the uncomplicated way some people do. Too many childhood memories attached. Too many split schedules and awkward gifts and adults pretending proximity counted as warmth. But my father always tried, and after I moved out on my own, he kept inviting me for Christmas Eve dinner like it was understood I had a seat forever. Once I got married, my husband and I split the holiday gently between his side and mine. Simple, functional. No one burst into song about family unity. Around New Year's, I started therapy. Not because I had one dramatic breakdown, though there had been several very respectable mini versions. More because I was exhausted by how often my mother's voice still lived in my head, translating my anger into selfishness. I was tired of having a physical stress response every time my phone lit up unexpectedly. Tired of explaining my family tree like a crime board every time a simple question turned complicated. Tired of acting functional while still emotionally reacting like a daughter waiting to be picked last on purpose. My therapist was calm in a way I initially distrusted. She had a face that made me want to confess things and then immediately take them back. On the first real session, after I explained the affair, the second family, the wedding situation, and the years of low-grade favoritism that had stretched around all of it like mold, she said, "It sounds like you've spent a long time being assigned the role of resilient one." I said, "That's a pretty way to describe being the one expected to swallow everything." She said, "Exactly. That was the beginning. Not some glorious transformation. Just the beginning of having somebody in the room who didn't treat my reactions as the problem separate from the pattern that formed them." We talked a lot about language, about how people in families like mine rebrand exploitation as generosity and disrespect as misunderstanding, about how hard it is to trust your own anger when you've been trained to experience it as a moral failure, about the difference between being compassionate and being available for misuse. I left those sessions feeling wrung out, but in a useful way, like emotional laundry. Then spring came, and with it, and the final, disgusting little twist that should have shocked me more than it did. My sister got my husband's number. We still don't know exactly how. Through a relative, through an old group chat, through one of those online directories that should honestly be illegal. However she did it, she got it. The first message came on a Thursday night while we were eating takeout on the couch. My husband's phone buzzed. He looked down, and I watched his expression change into the specific blankness of a man seeing something deeply stupid. He handed me the phone without a word. It was from my sister. The message said, "Hope married life isn't boring yet." That was it. No context. Just enough deniability to be technically mild and spiritually foul. I stared at the screen, waiting for anger to land. What I felt first, weirdly, was embarrassment. Not for me, for her. The kind that makes your shoulders pull in. Because there is no version of sending your sister's husband a message like that that doesn't make you look pathetic. My husband said very calmly, "I'm blocking her." And that should have been the end. But there were more messages before he could. Apparently, she had sent a cluster, and they loaded all at once. A joke about how he married the serious sister. A comment about me always needing things to be all about me. Then the one that made my stomach turn. "You're sweet, but you probably would have had more fun with someone less uptight." I swear to you, I saw red. Not metaphorically. I mean actual tunnel vision. Heart pounding in my ears, every old childhood humiliation showing up at once like they had been waiting backstage for their cue. I wish I could tell you I handled it like a mature married woman in therapy, grounded in self-worth and breathing techniques. I did not. I grabbed my own phone so fast I nearly dropped soy sauce on the couch. My husband put a hand on my wrist and said, "Don't text angry." I looked at him and said, "When exactly did you picture me texting? In heaven?" He laughed, which was rude but fair, and took both phones. Then he did something so simple it almost made me angrier because of how sane it was. He screenshotted every message, emailed them to himself, sent them to me, and blocked her number. No reply. No bait taken. Just evidence, silence, boundary. I paced our living room for 20 minutes in socks and fury. All I could think was, of course. Of course it ended here. Not because she wanted my husband specifically in some great romantic sense, but because she wanted proof she could still reach into my life and touch something. This had never been about a venue. It had never been about a wedding date. It had never even fully been about money. It was always about access, about standing in my doorway and making me feel unstable in my own home. Once my pulse came down enough for language to return, I sat on the rug with the screenshots and felt something colder settle under the rage. Clarity. Ugly, blunt clarity. Because if my sister was willing to message my husband like that after everything, then there was no innocent confusion left to debate. No, maybe she meant well. No, maybe mom got carried away. No, my sister was not a helpless younger daughter being dragged along by adults. She was a grown woman who had learned her whole life that if she wanted something, she could stretch toward it and someone else would explain it nicely later. I sent the screenshots to my father, not for permission, just so nobody could ever again say I had overreacted to vague tension. He called within 5 minutes, furious in the controlled way that is somehow more frightening than yelling. He asked if I was okay. I said yes, which was only partially true. Then he asked if I wanted him to contact my mother. I said no. I didn't want another circular argument where everybody acted shocked that behavior has a shape. My therapist, when I showed her the messages the next week, said something that stayed with me. She said, "Sometimes the final injury isn't bigger. It's just cleaner." She meant that after years of ambiguous harm, one unmistakable act can be weirdly stabilizing because it ends the internal debate. That's exactly what it did. It hurt. It disgusted me. But it also ended something. The constant little trial in my head where I kept presenting evidence and then questioning whether the judge had enough. A month later, my mother emailed me from a new address. The subject line said, "Please don't ignore this," an excellent way to ensure I would hate every word before opening it. The email was long, too long, full of the kind of language people use when they want credit for emotional effort without doing the actual labor of truth. She said she was heartbroken that things had gotten this far. She said my sister was in a bad place and not acting like herself. She said she understood why I was upset by the texts, but believed they came from pain and humiliation, not malicious intent. Not malicious intent. As if texting your sister's husband like that could somehow be explained away as hurt feelings. She also wrote that families sometimes act badly when they're wounded, and that if we all kept punishing each other forever, there would be nothing left. That line would have almost gotten me if it hadn't come from the person who kept insisting my punishments counted and hers did not. I drafted 6 responses. In one, I was icy and articulate. In another, I was devastating and funny. In a third, I was so honest it made my own stomach hurt. Then, I deleted all of them, because none of those replies would have been for her. They would have been for the 14-year-old in me who still wanted a witness, still wanted the person who hurt her to finally say yes. That happened, and yes, it mattered. Instead, I wrote 4 lines. I said I was no longer willing to participate in any relationship where accountability was always rerouted into somebody else's pain. I said my sister contacting my husband confirmed exactly why distance was necessary. I said I did not want further contact from either of them. Then I asked her not to email me again. It wasn't cinematic, it wasn't satisfying. It was better, it was usable. She did email one more time, 2 weeks later, just to say she hoped motherhood would teach me grace someday. The joke there, of course, being that I wasn't a mother. She just likes speaking from imagined moral height. I deleted it unread after the preview line and blocked that address too. My husband and I eventually moved to a different apartment across town. Not because of stalking or danger or anything dramatic like that, mostly because our lease was up and the new place had better light and a dishwasher that didn't sound haunted. Still, I won't lie and say there wasn't something healing about packing our dishes into boxes and leaving rooms that had held too much tension. New address, new routines, same marriage, better walls. Therapy kept moving things around inside me. Some sessions left me angry, some embarrassingly tender. Some wanting to call my mother just to hear her sound disappointed so I could re-enter the old pattern and stop feeling the uncertainty of the new one. Healing is grossly non-linear, very inconvenient. Nobody advertises that part because it doesn't sell journals. One of the hardest things to admit was that some part of me had liked being the self-sufficient one. Not liked the pain, obviously, but liked the identity. The daughter who didn't ask for much. The older sister who could cope. The reasonable one. The one who could be wounded and still show up on time. Still make the spreadsheet. Still host politely. Still not ruin dinner. There is social reward in being the person who absorbs impact gracefully. People call you strong while standing on your neck. My therapist asked me once what would happen if I stopped making myself easy to abandon. I told her that sounded dramatic. She told me it sounded precise. Annoying woman. Very good at her job. I left that session feeling lighter, not fixed, just less haunted. And for a while, that was enough. Then sometime that fall, my mother's health took a minor turn. Nothing catastrophic. A procedure, some recovery time, the sort of thing families use as moral leverage within 24 hours. I heard about it from an aunt first, then from my father, who made a point of telling me he was only passing along information, not pressure. He asked if I wanted details. I said a few, not many. He gave me the basic facts and left it there. I spent the next week surprised by my own emotional response. I wasn't panicked. I wasn't even particularly compassionate in the way good daughters are supposed to be in movies. Mostly I was sad in a broad, dull way. Sad that illness so quickly reactivates expectations. Sad that part of me still worried what kind of person I was if I didn't rush back. Sad that even now care felt dangerous because it had so often been converted into access. I did not call her. I sent no flowers. I also did not feel triumphant about that. Boundary culture online makes it sound like distance always comes with a soundtrack and a better haircut. Sometimes it just feels like standing still while other people silently judge the shape of your mercy. What I did do was sit with the fact that compassion and contact are not the same thing. That was new for me. I could wish her recovery without reopening the door. I could feel sorry that her life had narrowed without volunteering to be pulled into the narrowing. I could grieve what never got built without pretending the blueprint had changed. The last time I saw my mother in person was by accident. It happened in early spring, almost 2 years after the wedding mess started, and a little over a year after my sister texted my husband. I was at a garden center with a cart full of things I had no business buying, because I am, at heart, a woman who repeatedly believes this time I will become the kind of person who keeps herbs alive. The place was crowded, damp from morning rain, and smelled like wet soil, fertilizer, and the kind of optimism I always have right before a plant dies in my care. I turned down one of the narrow outdoor aisles, and there she was near a display of flowering shrubs, holding a small plant and looking older than I expected. Not dramatically older, just softer around the edges, more tired. I think part of me had frozen her in the posture of constant emotional momentum, the way she always seemed to move through other people's boundaries like they were curtains. Seeing her still for once shook something loose. She saw me almost immediately. There are moments where your body decides before your mind does. My shoulders went tight. My stomach dropped. All the old wiring lit up. Run toward, run away, explain, protect, be good, don't cry, don't look weak, don't let her touch you, don't let her call you cold. Amazing how many internal voices can speak at once when one woman in a cardigan looks up from a hydrangea. She started to smile, cautiously, like someone approaching a stray animal that might bite. Then the smile faltered. Maybe because she saw my face. Maybe because she finally understood that time passing had not magically made access reappear. She said my name. I said hello because I am not a monster, despite popular rumor in certain corners of my extended family. There was an awkward silence after that. Rain tapping plastic overhead. A cartwheel squeaking somewhere. A couple arguing softly about mulch. Life just kept going around us like nothing important was happening. Then she asked how I was. There are few questions more loaded than that one when asked by someone who forfeited the right to casual updates. I could have told her I was fine. I could have lied. I could have listed promotions, therapy milestones, the fact that my marriage had settled into that rare, wonderful thing where safety becomes boring in the best way. Instead, I said, I'm doing well, which was true, and enough. She nodded. Her eyes got shiny almost immediately. That used to work on me every time. Used to send me straight into emotional triage, wondering what I could do to soothe the atmosphere, how quickly I could rewrite my own hurt into understanding. That day, I just noticed it. The same way you notice weather. She told me she'd been wanting to reach out, said she knew I didn't want contact, but she hoped maybe enough time had passed that we could talk, really talk. She said age had changed how she saw things. She said losing me had been harder than she knew how to admit. She said my sister was doing better now, which I found interesting because I had not asked for updates and because my sister somehow still occupied the sentence even here. I listened. Not warmly, not cruelly. Just listened. Then I said, "The problem was never that we didn't talk enough. It was that when we did, the truth always had to bend around someone else." She cried. Of course she cried. But for once, I didn't hear that as proof I had done something wrong. Tears are not always evidence of innocence. Sometimes they're just what happen when reality lands without cushioning. She asked if I really thought she had never loved me properly. That question hit deeper than the others because it stepped around logistics and into the rotten center. I took a breath and looked at her. Really looked. This woman who had once been young and selfish and probably scared and then older and stubborn and then so attached to the story of herself that honesty became a threat. I don't think she was a monster. That would have been easier. Monsters are simple. She was a woman with preferences, blind spots, vanity, fear, and an almost athletic ability to turn guilt into requests. So I told her the most honest thing I had. "I think you loved me in ways that were real to you," I said. "I also think those ways were too small for what being your daughter required." She stared at me like I'd spoken in another language. I didn't say it to wound her. I said it because therapy had finally dragged me to a place where I could separate intent from impact without excusing either. Maybe she loved me. Maybe she did. But a love that regularly asked me to disappear a little, yield a little, understand a little more, hurt quietly, make room, be generous, be mature, be strong. That love still failed me. Maybe she loved me in her own way, but that way still wasn't enough for a daughter. Nobody told me that growing up. I had to pay a woman by the hour to help me figure it out. My mother asked if there was anything she could do, and that somehow was the saddest part. Because if she'd asked that years earlier, maybe the answer would have been big and difficult, and maybe even possible. But by then the answer was small. "Respect the distance," I told her. "Don't ask other people to carry messages. Don't rewrite what happened. Don't use emergencies, birthdays, holidays, or guilt. Just let it be what it is." She pressed her lips together like she was trying not to argue. I could almost see the old reflexes rising. Explain, defend, compare daughters, reframe. And maybe to her credit, or maybe because there was a stranger nearby choosing between 2 bags of potting soil, she didn't. She just nodded. Then she said she was sorry. Not elegantly. Not in the exact words I had dreamed about in uglier years. No grand inventory of every wound. No perfect accountability statement. Just, "I'm sorry, Noelle. I should have protected you more than I asked you to understand. It wasn't enough to restore anything, but it was specific enough to be real." I thanked her for saying it. I did not hug her. I did not say everything was okay. I did not promise lunch. I left with rosemary, basil, and a trembling feeling in my chest that lasted the rest of the afternoon. When I got home, my husband found me repotting herbs on the balcony with the focus of someone disarming explosives. He asked what happened. I told him. He listened, then asked the most important question. "Do you feel pulled back in?" I stood there with dirt on my fingers and thought about it. The answer surprised me. "No," I said. "I just feel sad." That was new. Sad without urgency. Sad without craving. Sad without the fantasy that one conversation could recover a whole missing architecture of care. Just sad in a clean way. Human way. These days, when people ask about my family, I answer in proportions. I'm close with my father. I have a good relationship with my stepmother. My relationship with my mother is distant. My relationship with my sister is non-existent. Most people accept that summary because adults know not every silence needs a performance review. The ones who pry usually want a cleaner morality tale than real life offers. I don't give them one anymore. My husband and I bought a small house the year after the garden center encounter. Nothing fancy. Peeling paint in one room, weird cabinet handles, a backyard that looked manageable until the first serious attempt at maintenance nearly ended our marriage over a hose attachment. It was perfect. Ours in the deeply boring legal sense and the deeply emotional private one. We painted walls, fought about curtain rods, learned which neighbors overshared and which ones pretended not to watch from behind blinds while definitely watching. Normal life. Beautiful, underappreciated normal life. Sometimes when I stand at the kitchen sink in that house, I think about how much of adulthood is just building rooms where old dynamics have less oxygen, not eliminating memory, not becoming healed enough to never react, just choosing structures that don't require the same self-betrayals. A husband who tells me the truth without trying to soften it into nonsense. A father who never asks me to shrink for somebody else's comfort. A stepmother who cares without trying to claim a role that isn't hers. Friends who don't mistake my restraint for weakness. A home where nobody gets invited to make me prove my generosity by surrendering my peace. Therapy helped. Time helped. Marriage helped. Distance helped most of all. Every once in a while, especially around holidays, a little stab of grief still shows up. Usually when I see mothers and daughters shopping together or hear someone casually complain that their mom calls too often, and I feel that weird mix of envy and exhaustion. I don't romanticize what I lost anymore, but I do honor the fact that I lost something. Not a perfect mother. Not some fantasy woman in soft lighting who would have baked birthday cakes and chosen me every time. I lost the possibility of uncomplicated belonging on that side of the family, and even if the possibility was probably mostly imaginary, grieving it still counts. What changed is that I no longer mistake grief for instruction. I don't see my sadness and conclude I should reopen the door. I don't hear guilt and assume it means duty. That shift sounds small written out. In real life, it changed everything. So no, this story does not end with reconciliation at Christmas, or a tearful hospital bedside, or my sister finally confessing in public that she wanted my wedding, my life, my husband, my whatever, because envy had hollowed her out. Real life is usually less theatrical and more useful than that. It ends with distance held, with one decent apology arriving late and not being treated like a time machine, with me understanding that closure is not the same as reunion, with my husband locking the back door at night while I check whether the basil is somehow dying again, with my father still calling on Sundays, with my stepmother dropping off soup when one of us is sick, with me, slowly, becoming the kind of woman who doesn't call herself cruel for refusing to be consumed. If you had asked me years ago what justice would look like, I probably would have said exposure, vindication, everybody finally seeing what I saw, my mother admitting everything, my sister embarrassed, a big dramatic balancing of scales. And yes, some of that happened in pieces. People did see more than they were supposed to. My sister did humiliate herself. My mother did lose access she took for granted. But real justice, at least for me, ended up quieter. It was getting married without them there. It was hearing my husband say without hesitation that he'd block my mother if I wanted. It was my father calling me his priority without using those exact words because he never had to. It was learning that strong and available are not synonyms. It was understanding that love can fail without being fake. It was finally believing that being asked to disappear gracefully is not the same thing as being loved maturely. And maybe most of all, it was this. I stopped waiting to be chosen by people who needed me easiest when I was least visible. That waiting had taken up more of my life than I knew. Not anymore. I still have the wedding invitation sample from my own planner tucked in a drawer with old documents and expired coupons. Not as a wound. More like evidence that my life kept moving even when other people tried to write themselves over it. Some days that's all closure is.